Mr. Hensley's gaze didn't waver. His arms crossed as he took a small step closer. His voice cut like a blade. You think you can demand the truth from me just like that? His words hit Jason hard. You've judged me without knowing the full story. You've assumed things, haven't you? Jason's face burned with anger. His voice grew louder, desperate. Assume? You left me with no answers my entire life. You left me wondering if I mattered to you at all. The words lingered in the air. Jason could feel his emotions spiral. Mr. Hensley didn't respond immediately. His face stayed neutral, but Jason could feel him measuring every word. Finally, after a deep breath, Mr. Hensley motioned toward the house. Come inside, he said simply. Jason hesitated. His legs felt heavy. Fear and curiosity warred within him. But before his thoughts could stop him, he followed Mr. Hensley into the house. Inside the mansion, a conversation by the fire. The inside of the house was warm and inviting, with the faint scent of wood and leather in the air. A crackling fire lit up the living room, its glow dancing on the walls. Jason took a deep breath as he sat down on a leather couch, unable to meet Mr. Hensley's gaze. His hands fidgeted in his lap. Mr. Hensley sat across from him, his voice low and steady. I left because I thought it would give you space to figure your life out. But I see now that leaving hurt you more than I could have imagined. I should have stayed, he said quietly. Jason looked at the fire, struggling to process his emotions. Why did you leave? He managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Hensley's shoulders relaxed a bit as he spoke again, his tone even quieter this time. Fear, he admitted. Fear of judgment. Fear of you thinking I made the wrong choices. I thought honesty would hurt you. But silence only made things worse. Jason listened, his emotions tangled. The words hit harder than he expected. All these years of wondering of pain now seemed to make sense, at least a little. His voice cracked as he pressed for more. So you were afraid? Mr. Hensley nodded slowly. I made mistakes. I didn't tell you the truth. I thought you would struggle without me, but I failed you by staying silent. I thought that by stepping away, I would give you the chance to become your own person. But in reality, I only left you in the dark. Jason could feel his anger, pain, and frustration bubbling again. Still, there was something about Mr. Hensley's voice that kept him from snapping. It wasn't denial. It wasn't an attempt to dodge the truth. His words felt real, honest. You must learn this, Jason, Mr. Hensley continued, leaning forward slightly. His voice had grown steady but gentle. Your life is your own. I can explain some things, but your journey is yours to live. You can't live my life or define yourself by my choices. Jason stared into the fire. His emotions swirled. Anger, confusion, relief, and sadness. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but hearing Mr. Hensley admit his fears and mistakes felt like a starting point. It didn't fix everything. It didn't make all the pain disappear. But it gave Jason context, understanding, and that felt like a kind of freedom. A fresh perspective. The two spent the next few hours talking, their conversation careful, deliberate. Mr. Hensley shared stories of mistakes, regrets, and lessons learned over the years. Jason listened, for once without judgment, just trying to understand. The stories weren't perfect, but they felt honest, real. Forgiveness didn't erase the pain or mistakes. It wasn't about forgetting or pretending things hadn't happened. It was about letting go of bitterness and allowing yourself to heal. Jason's mind felt clearer when the conversation came to a close. His feelings didn't disappear, but now they didn't feel so sharp, so all-consuming. A new beginning. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the trees as Jason stepped outside. The golden glow warmed his face as he looked back at the mansion one last time. Mr. Hensley stood on the porch, his figure small in the morning light, waving goodbye. Jason lifted his hand in return and felt a strange kind of peace. He took a deep breath and began walking toward his next steps. His journey wasn't over. He still had questions, doubts, and challenges ahead. But now he knew this was the first step toward healing. The weight in his chest felt lighter. Key message: forgiveness doesn't erase pain or mistakes, but it gives you the freedom to grow, learn, and move forward. Understanding comes through listening, learning, and letting go, not through judgment. One afternoon, as he walked home from school through his neighborhood, he spotted something familiar. Mr. Hensley was outside in his garden, tending to a patch of tomato plants. His hands were covered in dirt, his sleeves rolled up, and he looked completely at ease. Jason's heart jumped in his chest. Before he could stop himself, he blurted out, "Mr. Hensley." Mr. Hensley looked up from the garden with a kind smile. "Well, hello there, Jason. How are you?" Jason tried to sound casual, but his voice wavered. I have a question about last night." Mr. Hensley's brow furrowed slightly. "Last night?" Jason took a deep breath. His throat felt dry. "You were in a new car, a Rolls Royce." For a moment, Mr. Hensley's smile disappeared. His face became unreadable, a flicker of hesitation there before he spoke. His voice lowered, becoming more serious. "Oh, that was just something special, Jason. Nothing for you to worry about." Jason could feel the unease in his voice. His questions pushed their way out, despite his hesitation. "Mr. Hensley, is everything okay? How did you get that car?" Mr. Hensley paused, staring at him for a moment. His gaze was steady, but Jason could tell that something was off. Finally, Mr. Hensley spoke, his voice softer. "Let's just say I've had a few changes lately. Nothing you need to worry about." Before Jason could ask another question, Mr. Hensley turned back to his garden and started digging again. Jason stood there, his stomach sinking. His voice felt stuck. His questions hung in the air, unanswered. Something was wrong. Jason could feel it in every nerve in his body. The questions that wouldn't go away. The next few days felt heavier. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that he was onto something, that Mr. Hensley's response had been more than just an innocent brush-off. But what could he do? How could he figure out the truth without getting himself into trouble? His curiosity and fear were at war with each other. He tried to go back to his routine, homework, hanging with Mark, and practicing guitar. But his thoughts returned to Mr. Hensley and his strange new car. Jason felt torn. Should he dig deeper into this mystery and risk finding something he wasn't ready to know? Or should he let it go and live his normal, quiet life? His heart was a constant tug of war. Would he risk everything to uncover the truth? Or would he let fear win? The questions lingered. And Jason knew this wasn't just about a car. It was about trust, secrets, and the fears that come when you realize that the world around you might not be what it seems. Jason now stands at a crossroads. The clues are beginning to pile up, but fear and uncertainty linger. What will he decide to do? The journey is only beginning. Stay tuned. The moment of truth. Jason's heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst. His hands trembled as he gripped his phone, standing in front of the towering mansion gates. His breaths came in quick, shallow gasps. The moment he had worked so hard to make happen was finally here. He had come for answers, the kind that had kept him up at night. Now, though, it felt surreal, like he was stepping into a dream. He tried to steady himself, but his fingers shook too much as he dialed the number again. His voice barely came out as a whisper. "Please, pick up." The sound of a car engine roared in the distance. Jason turned his head just as headlights pierced the dark night. His stomach dropped. The car was black, sleek, and unmistakable. It was him, Mr. Hensley. Jason's chest tightened. The car pulled up, the headlights briefly lighting up his face. He could feel his fear grow with every second. His feet felt as though they were stuck to the pavement, but somehow he forced himself to step into the driveway. The gates groaned as they opened, and Mr. Hensley stepped out of the car. Jason's voice caught. He couldn't find the strength to speak, but the words pushed their way out anyway. "Mr. Hensley." His voice felt weak, uncertain. Mr. Hensley looked at him with a calm but unreadable expression. "You're here," he said. His voice was steady, colder now. "Why are you here, Jason?" Jason could feel all his frustration boiling to the surface. His voice broke as he spoke. I need to know the truth. About you. About me. About everything. I felt lost for too long." Mr. Hensley's gaze didn't waver. His arms crossed as he took a small step closer. His voice cut like a blade. Jason's voice caught. He couldn't find the strength to speak, but the words pushed their way out anyway. "Mr. Hensley." His voice felt weak, uncertain. Mr. Hensley looked at him with a calm but unreadable expression. "You're here," he said. His voice was steady, colder now. "Why are you here, Jason?" Jason could feel all his frustration boiling to the surface. His voice broke as he spoke. I need to know the truth. About you. About me. About everything. I felt lost for too long. It wasn't just about the car. It was about everything. What did he not know about the people in his town? What secrets did they keep? What other lives existed behind the appearances, the simple small-town smiles, and the routines they all followed? His mind felt clouded with questions. Before he could figure anything out, he saw Mr. Hensley close the car door, start the engine, and drive off. The sound of the engine humming in the cold night air seemed to pierce Jason's thoughts. He stayed rooted in his spot, the cold wind hitting his face, his body trembling. Something about that moment stuck with him. It felt like the kind of thing that could change everything. Like he just witnessed something important, even if he didn't know why. His mind replayed the image, Mr. Hensley, his old coat, and the Rolls-Royce disappearing into the distance. Jason knew he couldn't shake this feeling. This wasn't just about a fancy car. It was about more than appearances or wealth or small-town life. It was about fear, about uncertainty, about realizing that life might not be as simple as it had always seemed. But he didn't have the answers yet. So he stood there, cold, confused, and uncertain, watching the path the car had taken and wondering if his life was about to change forever. This was just the beginning. Jason couldn't get the image out of his head. Mr. Hensley, calm and steady in his worn green coat, stepping into a shiny black Rolls-Royce. His mind kept replaying the moment. It didn't make sense. Nothing about it did. Mr. Hensley didn't own a fancy car, not in a small town like this. It gnawed at Jason, an image that wouldn't go away. The next morning, breakfast and doubts. The cafeteria at school was as noisy as usual. Students were sitting at tables, laughing, eating, and talking about their plans for the weekend. Jason sat at a table with Mark, his best friend. Mark was busy eating scrambled eggs and had his usual grin on his face, but Jason couldn't shake the knot in his stomach. "You okay, man?" Mark asked, noticing Jason wasn't touching his food. Jason hesitated. His spoon hovered midair. His voice came out low. "Last night, I saw something strange." Mark looked up from his plate, his chewing slowing. "Strange? Like what?" Jason struggled to find the right words. He wasn't even sure he could explain it properly. His throat felt tight. Mr. Hensley wasn't driving his old truck last night. He was in a Rolls-Royce. Mark put his fork down, staring at him now. "Wait, what? Are you serious?" Jason looked around nervously, making sure no one could overhear. "I swear, Mark, it was a black, shiny Rolls-Royce. I couldn't believe it." Mark frowned slightly, uncertain. "Jason, maybe you were just tired or seeing things. It was cold last night. Your mind could have played tricks on you." But Jason shook his head, his voice firm now. "No, Mark, I know what I saw, I promise." Mark didn't press the issue any further. He picked up his fork again and went back to the scrambled eggs. But Jason couldn't stop thinking about it. His head felt full as if his thoughts were swimming. Even with Mark's casual dismissal, he knew what he saw was real. After school, Jason's obsession builds. Jason tried to focus on his normal routine, homework, playing his guitar, and going for his usual evening runs. But no matter what he did, he couldn't shake the image of Mr. Hensley stepping into that Rolls-Royce. It felt important, like a piece of a puzzle he couldn't solve. But the problem was, where would he even begin to look for answers? That evening, as he sat in his bedroom strumming his guitar, his mom called him down for dinner. "You've been quiet lately," she said as she set a plate of spaghetti on the table. Jason shrugged. "Nothing much, just tired." His mom's gaze lingered on him for a moment, her smile soft but curious. "You sure everything's okay? You can talk to me about anything, Jason." Jason wanted to tell her, but he couldn't find the words. His chest felt tight. He tried to sound casual, hiding the worry. "I'm fine," he said quickly. She didn't push him further. They ate dinner together, the conversation light, but Jason couldn't shake his worry. His mind felt restless as he stared at the ceiling that night. That feeling, the one from the parking lot, wasn't going away. It felt important, though he couldn't figure out why. I need to find out what's going on, he thought to himself before he drifted to sleep. Jason stood outside his high school, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets to escape the sharp bite of the cold wind. The air smelled faintly of wet leaves and rust, and his breath formed small clouds in the chilly breeze. Around him, the parking lot was alive with the chatter of students, laughter, teasing, plans for the weekend. But Jason felt a little disconnected from all of it, like an observer, rather than a part of the noise. He was 17, with dark brown hair that always seemed to get in his eyes. His clothes were simple, faded jeans and a hoodie, and they matched how most people at school viewed him, quiet, reserved, and easy to overlook. That was fine by him. Jason didn't mind being in the background. He liked the idea of staying out of attention and keeping things simple. His life didn't hold big ambitions or dreams of fame. He found joy in the small things, strumming his guitar when no one was around, racing his bike through the neighborhood after sunset, or watching the sky change colors as the sun disappeared behind the horizon. His mother had taught him to cherish these moments and to stick to what he could control. Dreams could feel nice, but they didn't always lead to real answers, she always said. Jason lived a simple life with his mom. Their little house sat on the outskirts of town. Nothing fancy, but it was theirs. She worked 2 jobs, one as a waitress at the local diner, and the other cleaning offices at night. Their days weren't always easy, but they managed. Jason admired how hard his mother worked to keep them afloat, though sometimes he wished he could take some of her burden away. Her exhaustion felt heavy, a reminder that life wasn't always fair. He didn't have many friends, just one, Mark. Mark was outgoing, bold, and had a laugh that could fill a room. They shared adventures, climbing old fences, sneaking into the woods to watch the stars, and dreaming about what life could be like if things were different. With Mark, dreams felt real and possible, especially in the dark when no one could judge or criticize. Tonight, though, felt different. Jason couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in his chest. Something was coming, something he couldn't explain. His mind drifted back to his mom from the other night. He remembered the way her voice sounded tired as she made dinner in the small kitchen, the way her shoulders seemed to slump with the weight of her long hours. Fear crept into him as he remembered that feeling, the constant worry of never being enough, never doing enough, and never escaping the uncertainties of his life. It wasn't a new feeling, but it lingered. He looked at his hands, buried deeper in his jacket as if they could somehow shield him from his thoughts. What could I even do? Where would I start? He didn't have the answers. Jason was so caught in his own thoughts that he barely heard Mark calling his name as he approached. Mark had his hands in his pockets, his usual wide smile on his face. You coming with me to the diner after this? Mark asked easily, as if the answer was no big deal. His voice was light, and his smile was genuine. Jason hesitated. His first instinct was to say yes, but there was that knot in his chest again, that familiar tug of hesitation. His voice came out quieter than intended. I'll think about it, he said, unsure of himself. Mark shrugged with his usual confidence and started walking toward his car. The wind picked up again, and Jason could feel the cold biting through his jacket. He couldn't shake the unease as he stood there. And then, across the parking lot, he saw him. It was Mr. Hensley. Mr. Hensley was a quiet, well-known figure in the town. Everyone knew him as a kind, gentle farmer who always had time for a friendly wave or a smile. His green coat and worn-out truck were familiar sights in this little town. Most days, Mr. Hensley seemed like a symbol of simplicity, steady, dependable, and calm. But this wasn't the usual picture of Mr. Hensley. He wasn't standing beside his usual old pickup truck. No, he was beside a shiny, black Rolls-Royce, a car that gleamed under the pale glow of the streetlights. Jason blinked, convinced he must have imagined it, but no, it was real. Mr. Hensley stood there, his hands gripping the door handle, his face as calm as ever. Then, without hesitation, he stepped into the car and started the engine. Jason froze. His heart raced as he stared, unable to look away. He could feel his hands trembling. Was this a mistake? Had he imagined it? But there was no denying what he was seeing. Mr. Hensley, in his worn-out green coat, was now sitting confidently behind the wheel of this luxurious vehicle. Jason's thoughts spiraled. How could this be? What did this mean? His stomach felt like it had tied itself into a knot. Every logical explanation felt too far-fetched. He was cold, his thoughts were loud, and yet he couldn't move. His breath came in short, shallow bursts.